Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to have the distinguished Dr. R. Edward Freeman, Grace Business Talk today, as our esteemed guest. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. R. Edward Freeman is one of the most influential thinkers in modern business scholarship, a philosopher turned strategist who fundamentally changed how the world thinks about business and its role in society. He holds the distinguished titles of Stephen E. Basson University Professor and Olson Professor of Business Administration at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, where he also served as academic director of the Institute for Business and Society. His global reach extends to adjunct and visiting professorships at Copenhagen Business School, Nairobi Business School, and Monash University, along with honorary appointments at George Washington University and the University of Melbourne. Professor Freeman's intellectual journey began at Duke University, where he studied mathematics and philosophy and culminated in a PhD in philosophy from Washington University. That philosophical foundation became the bedrock of his landmark 1984 book, Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach, a work that sparked a global conversation about how businesses build strategy around relationships, not just profits. Now, in its Cambridge edition, the book remains one of the most cited works in business literature. Over 4 decades, Dr. Freeman has authored or edited more than 100 volumes and 200 articles spanning stakeholder management, business strategy, and ethics. His recent books include Defeating Dengue, a multi-stakeholder approach to problem solving, The Power of End, Responsible Business Without Trade-offs, Model of Leadership in Plato and Beyond, and Managing for Stakeholders. Yeah. He has edited landmark series of Oxford and Cambridge, also served as a co-editor in chief of the Journal of Business Ethics for 5 years. The recognition Dr. Freeman has received is a global as his influence. 7 universities across Europe and North America have awarded him honorary doctorates, and he has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the World Resources Institute, the Aspen Institute, and the Academy of Management, the Society for Business Ethics, and the Humboldt University Conference on Corporate Social Responsibility. His teaching has been celebrated at every institution he has served, from the Wharton School to Darden to the Academy of Management and the State of Virginia. Beyond academia, Professor Freeman is a lifelong student of philosophy, martial arts, and the blues, a combination that perhaps explains the depth and creativity he brings to his scholarship. He is co-principal of Stakeholder Media LLC and host of the Stakeholder podcast, continuing to bring the ideas he pioneered to audiences around the world. In today's episode, we are truly privileged to sit down with Dr. R. Edward Freeman, a towering figure in the world of business ethics and stakeholder theory. Dr. Freeman takes us on a fascinating journey deep into the heart of his compelling book, Defeating Dengue, a multi-stakeholder approach to problem solving, exploring how the principles of stakeholder thinking can be applied to tackle complex real-world challenges that go far beyond the boardroom. This is a conversation you want to miss. The book is co-authored with Andrew Sell, a senior research associate at the Virginia Department of Social Services. Defeating Dengue is the proud recipient of the 2025 SIM Outstanding Book Award, presented by the Social Issues in Management Division of the Academy of Management. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. R. Edward Freeman to the conversation. Professor Freeman, your gracious acceptance of our invitation means a great deal to us, and it is with an immense honor and delight that we welcome you to Business Talk.
Very, very happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Dr. Freeman, dengue fever might seem like an unusual subject for a business scholar. What first drew you and Andrew Sell to this remarkable story unfolding in Yogyakarta, Indonesia? And how did you see it through the lens of stakeholder theory?
Well, I'm not, sometimes I think I'm not sure how I got involved in this. George Tahia, who's part of the Tahia family, is a Darden School alum. And we had him come and talk to a class I taught with Dean Scott Beardsley on the role of the CEO in the 21st century. And George talked about this project and how and what they were trying to do. I thought it was such a great project that I said, look, I want to write a case study about this, as that's what business schools do. It's what we do in particular. So I had been to Indonesia several times. I taught there in the 90s at a business school, and so I was pretty familiar with the country. So I went to Indonesia to write a case, and in doing so, I met a number of the people involved, and it was such an incredible. Probably it was the most incredible stakeholder engagement project I'd ever seen. And I said to them, I said, look, I I wrote the case, but I said, you've done so much more here. This is groundbreaking, just in terms of not only the what the results are going to be, but it's groundbreaking in terms of the way you manage the project, et cetera, that you may not realize, and you need to have a book written about this. And I said, I'll go back to the U.S. and try to find a writer for you. And I did. I was kind of unsuccessful for the first few months I was trying. A lot of the people who I knew were good, writers, already had projects going. And then COVID happened. And of course, when COVID happened, no one could go to Indonesia and interview people and tell the story. I was still, I think I had convinced the family that they needed to have a book written. And then they turned to me and said, well, would you write it? And gee, I had never done anything like this before, to write a book, just trying to tell the story. And I said, yes. They said, well, we'll hire Jakarta Post reporter, former Jakarta Post reporter, Ibu Rita Widyadanta, and she'll interview everybody and translate the transcripts and send them to you. And so the more I learned about this, I began, and Andrew Sell, my co-author, and I began to see how special this was. So Ibu Rita sent us 1,000+ pages of transcripts, and we tried to put the story together from that. And we also did some interviews long distance, but she actually interviewed everybody from women in the community who were volunteers to the Sultan of Jakarta. And so it was a matter of trying to weave together what we saw was an incredible number of stories that we don't usually think about. There was the story of the family and what they did, the business family. There was a story about the science, because this was a really remarkable scientific breakthrough that had happened. There was a story about the project management and how the foundation didn't just write checks, they actually helped manage the project. A story about the kind of multiple stakeholders that were involved. I tend to see everything through a stakeholder lens. I can't help that really. And a story about the community and a lot of the women in the community who were very economically poor, who made this happen. So trying to weave those stories together was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And Andrew and I spent a couple of years trying to do that. By the time we were finished, they had the results from the final project, which were remarkable. They could reduce the incidence of dengue fever by, I think, 77% and reduced hospitalizations by 86%. And that was just remarkable, because dengue fever is an awful disease. It was called breakbone fever because it was so painful. And you can have it 4 times, and each time it's worse. And children die from this all over the world every year. So it's a horrible thing. And what this business family did was they took on this challenge, and they saved a lot of lives. And it was truly, truly a remarkable story. But I want to be clear, I didn't really have anything to do with the project. I just wrote the story. And that was a pretty, for me, an interesting and developmental process to be on the outside looking in. Usually I'm on the inside working with companies about how to deal with their stakeholders, etc. As opposed to here, I was just on the outside trying to figure out what they had done and what was successful.
Professor, at the heart of this project is a fascinating scientific discovery, infecting mosquitoes with a Wolbachia bacterium to prevent them from transmitting dengue. Can you walk us through this breakthrough and explain why moving it from the laboratory into the real world was the hardest part?
Well, there were researchers in Australia who figured out that if you injected this bacteria into a mosquito, now how you inject a bacteria into a mosquito, I still don't understand quite how that scientific process works because I'm a philosopher, not a scientist. But if you did that, the Wolbachia bacteria prevented the spread of a virus like the dengue virus and also Zika, I believe. And they had field tested it in Australia. This is under the guise of the World Mosquito Project funded by the Gates Foundation. And the testing wasn't really robust. They didn't have enough cases. So they didn't have enough cases to make a really scientifically solid thing. The Tahia family, meanwhile, had taken on this challenge of doing something with dengue, and they spent 5 years with implementing the technology in Jakarta, that didn't work. Yet they had done such a great job with the community, and the community thought so highly of them that that they when they heard about this new technology, the Wolbachia technology, they were willing to try it. It turns out when you release these Wolbachia-laden mosquitoes into the wild, and they're a kind of mosquito called Aedes aegypti, which are the main spreaders of dengue. When you release them into the wild and they breed with wild mosquitoes, it block the Wolbachia bacteria blocks the spread of the virus, but it's passed on through 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 their breeding mosquitoes in the wild. So it's kind of like a good sexually transmitted disease, I guess, for mosquitoes. So if you can get the population of mosquitoes, the wild mosquitoes, up to around 70-80%, you'll start to see a drop in the dengue virus. That was the hypothesis, because it can't be transmitted. And so to do that, however, you have to release hundreds of millions of mosquitoes. Now, I'm not familiar so much with many places. I do know in Indonesia, as I think in India as well, where I've been many times, mosquitoes are not seen as friendly animals. They're not family pets. We know that they transmit disease. And so the idea was to do a field experiment to really prove scientifically that this works. And there are all kinds of problems initially with doing this. It turns out, there's an issue with these are the original mosquitoes were Australian. Indonesia's a Muslim country. Majority are these mosquitoes halal was an issue they had to deal with. Is this a case of first world science experimenting on developing world? Big issue there. And so there are all of these issues just to get the project off the ground. And the science was truly amazing. And the Tahias were committed enough to try to do something about this, and the community was committed to them because, in the words of one of the community members I met at a community meeting, look, they said to one of the Tahia brothers, Shakon, look, you all have taught us how to take care of ourselves because during the previous project, It was about something to do with water temperatures and all this kind of stuff. So they had great community relationships to do this. On the other hand, you've got to put buckets of mosquito larvae that have the Wolbachia in them at every house. And the ethics committee at the university said if any adult in the household objects, you can't put the bucket of larvae up, and you can't put one up for a certain amount of area around it. I don't remember exactly what it was. So there are all of these roadblocks that were there. So the foundation put together a coalition. It was the World Mosquito Project was in a sense, donating the technology because they wanted to have this validated. Gajah Mada University, which is a university in Yogyakarta in their medical school, and the Tahia Foundation they had a memorandum of understanding about how this was going to work. But those things only go so far. It's when you actually figure out who's got to do what. Typically we think about that as the foundation would write checks and they spend it, but that's not the way they worked. They had a very strong hands-on approach that they had learned from their businesses. The Tahia businesses, which were in a number of sectors, were very values driven, very stakeholder driven, very purpose driven. And they brought that to this project so that, they spent a lot of time talking about the values of the foundation, the mission of the project to get people involved. And once again, it was a truly remarkable project because literally you're talking about thousands of people. They did over, I think, I'm going to say that I think this is the right number, 10,000 stakeholder interviews over the years, and it took them 10 years. This was not an overnight thing. This is a project that literally took 10 years to do. So the technology is remarkable, the science is remarkable, but it doesn't work. I mean, you won't know about the science. It's certainly true in public health until you can make it work in the real world.
Professor, the partnership in Yogyakarta brought together a leading business family, university faculty, medical
Mhm.
researchers, local volunteers, and even the Sultan of Yogyakarta. How did such a diverse group of stakeholders find a common purpose? And what kept them aligned over more than a decade of collaboration?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question, Deepak, and I think what kept them aligned really was, I mean, dengue fever is an awful thing, and almost everybody's family in Indonesia has been affected by it one way or another. And I think the courage of the family saying, we're going to do something about this. We've spent 5 years and it hasn't worked. We're gonna keep going because we think this new technology will work. I think the courage of the family and got transmitted to the others. The medical researchers, the medical school people, wanted to do something about this because again, their families had been affected too. Same for the volunteers in the community, many of which were women because women had dealt with this with their children. They had seen their children affected by dengue fever. And so I think the audaciousness of the project, let's figure out if we can defeat this, was something that people signed up for. Now, having said that, not everybody was on board all the time. Some people decided they didn't want these mosquitoes, in around their house. Also, there was a complexity here because you also had to do this in a way that was scientifically valid. You had to put mosquito traps in houses because you needed to in the first phase figure out how you get the population up to over 70% Wolbachia mosquitoes. So you had to trap mosquitoes, and when they died, that you had to trap them, and you had to take those traps back to the lab and figure out how many of them were Wolbachia mosquitoes and how many were not, because you needed to figure out what the population needed to be. So it was not like getting a vaccination, or it's not like spraying. It took real effort and action on behalf of the families in Georgia, and and certainly the thousands of volunteers that were there. The foundation had an approach to philanthropy that they called venture-philanthropy, where you invest in risky things, but you don't just give the money and go away. You fund it, and they funded the Tahia Foundation funded this project all themselves. They did not take money from the Gates Foundation, etc. They funded this themselves, and added their own management expertise, which is substantial, given the way they had that the family had developed its businesses in Indonesia. Uh, the family came the scion of the family and his spouse who'd passed away, Julius Tahia, had been the CEO of Caltex Pacifica, an oil company in Indonesia, and his sons George and Shakun. George was our alumni. It was running the business. Shakun was a doctor, and their wives, Laurel and Shelley, were all active participants in how this worked. And I sort of think their courage, maybe I'm projecting too much, but their courage, you could see them in the passion with which we were attacking this problem. Um, and I think that was contagious. It certainly was for me. I mean, and again, all I did was write the story, but for every bit we uncovered, I thought, oh my God, these people are doing something that's really remarkable. And why aren't more business families doing this? We hear a lot about grand challenges, but there aren't many of these stories where people take on something that's been a grand challenge for a long time, and actually stick with it from the beginning, 15 years, to make some progress. But that's what it takes.
Professor, the Tahija Foundation played a pivotal role in funding and managing this initiative. What does their involvement tell us about unique
Yeah.
responsibility and opportunity that business families have when it comes to tackling society's biggest challenges?
Well, I think it says there's a lot of opportunity. And in writing the book, the Tahia family was very interested in having that message be in the book, that they saw this as kind of a proof point that business families can do more. As George Tahia often said, look, in developing world, governments can't do everything. They don't have the resources. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the management expertise. Business has to help. Business has to be a part of society. Has to be seen as a part of society. And of course, I thought this was absolutely true. It's what I had seen in Indonesia. It's what I had seen in India and in other places. Um, and they were actually doing it. They were actually showing how to do this at a level that was more than, let's say, I'm going to give 2% corporate responsibility, or I'm going to fund, some programs and communities, etc. There's nothing wrong with those things. But I think what I walked away with is business families can do a lot more. And having said that, businesses can do a lot more too. But it takes not just writing checks, it takes the um, the metal to actually put together and help manage these multi-stakeholder partnerships.
Professor, over 12,400 volunteers in Yogyakarta help release mosquitoes in their own backyards. How did the partnerships earn their extraordinary level of community trust? And what lessons does that hold for any organization attempting large-scale social change?
Well, that's really a remarkable story. One of the chapters in the book is about how they did the community stuff, and they did a number of things that were unique in my experience. One of the things they did was they had a sort of hotline in which anybody in the community could submit a question, and they would get back to them within 24 hours with an answer. Now you can imagine this is again in some very economically poor places in the middle of Java. Yogyakarta is sort of a city of about 400,000. It's in a special area ruled by the Sultan of Yogyakarta, that's in the Indonesian constitution. But there's some very poor areas, and people are not always well educated. And so you got to teach them that these mosquitoes are actually good mosquitoes. In a world in which mosquitoes look to me like all they bring is disease. And so the community outreach, they did everything from having parties to murals on the wall to they had people dressed up like Wally the Wolbachia mosquito, riding bikes and answering people's questions, etc. And then there were some areas that were sort of opposed to this. And then part of what happened was they looked to neighboring areas and they saw that their kids weren't in the neighboring areas weren't getting dengue fever. And so again, that kind of came that helped as well. But it was not a conflict-free, happy talk, feel good thing all the time. They had to work very hard to get that community support, and the foundation worked very hard to get the volunteers to understand the values that were there, and how to treat people that may be different or they may have different views from them. And that's another piece of the story. Important in this were these women, these often very poor women. Because see, when to make this scientifically respectful, when somebody comes down with dengue fever, they have to go to a hospital to get tested, so you can mark, well, this person had dengue or they didn't. And so it was more than just uh, counting, releasing and counting a bunch of mosquitoes. There was a whole process that went through the whole disease cycle that the volunteers had to be involved with. And again, the Tahia Foundation was important in managing that process.
Professor, the randomized control trial showed a 77% reduction in dengue cases and an 86% reduction in hospitalization in treated areas. Beyond the numbers, what did that outcome mean for the people of Yogyakarta and for the broader promise of the multi-stakeholder model?
Well, it's interesting. The way they did this, of course, you had to do a randomized control. So you had areas of Georgia where these Wolbachia mosquitoes were released, and you had areas where they weren't released because you needed to compare the results. And one of the things, one of the most fun things they did, how do you pick which areas get the good mosquitoes and which ones don't? Well, the foundation decided they would have a party and they'd have a lottery. And so they had a party, they engaged the community leaders, and of course they promised that when the when the results were in, they would deliver the good mosquitoes to everyone, which they did. Now your audience may not know, I certainly didn't. Mosquitoes are kind of lazy. They don't really, they won't cross a road or a river or that sort of stuff. And so you can have a kind of discrete area that you can treat, and then an area, next to it where it's not treated, and it's not much, mosquitoes are not roaming all over the city, kind of thing. That's not what they do. I appreciated after doing this, incredible what an apex predator mosquitoes are. I think mosquitoes are responsible for more human deaths than any other cause in human history. And so the implications for the community were, of course, they were amazed by the end of this because the population, once you get mosquitoes over 70% of good ones, then the population becomes self-replicating. Because every time a wild mosquito breeds with a Wolbachia mosquito, either they're rendered sterile or they can't reproduce the virus. And so soon the population goes over 100%, and you don't have to keep releasing mosquitoes every year. And that's the really remarkable thing. There is a dengue vaccine, but it's really too expensive for places like Indonesia, and it turns out it's only about 50% effective. And if you've had it once and then take the vaccine, I think your chances of it being effective are even less. And so this was a pretty you need a mosquito factory to do that. I was in a room in Georgia. There were about 1 million mosquitoes, and I was a little intimidated, even though they were in cages. I was still pretty intimidated by all these mosquitoes. And they had to release several 100 million mosquitoes a week for a while. And again, getting the community on board. Once they were on board, once they trusted the foundation and the project and all the things that the project did to get the community on board, I think it cemented an incredible relationship between the Tahias, their partners, and the local communities. It was an approach that Andrew and I called hyper-local, which means I'm not just writing checks, I'm not just working with organizations. It's house to house, person to person, and it's seeing stakeholders not as part of a functional role, but seeing them as individual humans. And I think that hyper-local approach was incredibly important here.
Professor, your career has largely been focused on business strategy and ethics. How does stakeholder theory translate into a public health context? And did working on this project challenge or expand your original thinking about what stakeholder engagement can achieve?
Yeah, I mean, because I think public health projects are interesting because again, I think this hyper-local approach is the only way to approach them. Um, I remember when I was growing up, when the polio vaccines were invented, and I grew up in a very small town in the U.S. and you met in the high school gymnasium and took your polio vaccine in a sugar tube, and it was a community thing, you know. Um, and so again, there was this sort of community involvement in the U.S. in this rollout of, I think it was the Salk vaccine. I'm not sure which one it was. Um, and that has always stuck with me. But what this project said was that community involvement, community engagement is what's going to make public health projects work. You can have all the science in the world, but if you can't convince the community this is good for them, um, the science won't matter. I mean, we can eliminate, we have vaccines that could eliminate diseases like measles and smallpox, etc. But if the community listens to people who are anti-vaccine and think there's something wrong with this, and even though the science might not be there, the community engagement is not there. And basically in public health, that kills people. And so that's why community engagement is so incredibly important. Stakeholder engagement is important. You can't create value for stakeholders without engaging with them. And the more you engage, the more value you can create. And I think that's just as true for multinational companies as it is in public health projects. So what this did for me is it sort of um, it sort of continued to build my faith in this idea of stakeholder engagement, and that's the way you create value in business. And I was happy to see that translated over from public health, or those two things seem to me to be this kind of the same idea.
Professor, the book draws implications for all social enterprises seeking to address the world's biggest challenges. What are the 2 to 3 most critical ingredients you believe any multi-stakeholder partnership must have to sustain transformative work over the long term?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, my experience is this one, and some others I've read about and marginally been a part of. First of all, grand challenges take time. We're not going to solve global warming next week. Second of all, what we need is lots of experiments going on and some of them are going to work and some of them are not. This is a story of a case where the first experiment didn't work and the second one did. And then the issue becomes how do you scale it? How you scale it is, of course, a big challenge now. If we're right that it takes a lot of community engagement, then just releasing millions of Wolbachia mosquitoes isn't going to solve dengue fever. You really have to have that community engagement, that stakeholder engagement, and that needs to be managed. That needs to be someone who's going to be persistent about it, who's going to help overcome the barriers that inevitably exist. So, one of the successes, I mean, one of the lessons for me was about, look, this stuff is gonna take time. You need to be experimental. You need to be open to doing things different ways. You need to be, again, as I said, hyper local. You need to engage with people as not as functional roles, but as individuals. Um, and this stuff is hard. It's hard. It's easy to say, but it's hard to actually do. I think one of the things that made this work was, again, that vision, that audacious and courageous vision. Dengue fever has been around for hundreds of years. Now we're going to do something about this, and we're serious about it. And I think that's, there were times when people didn't know what the results were going to be, but they stuck to it. And I think sometimes oh, this technology doesn't work, so we'll give up. Or the other thing I see is, oh, we can't do anything. It's like the logic. You see somebody hungry and you say, well, I can't solve world hunger. So I can't give a hungry person a piece of bread. But that's bad law logic. You can't solve world hunger, but you can give somebody a piece of bread. So thinking about what you can actually do and thinking about it in again, audacious and courageous way. That's in part what I took away from that. And you can't ignore the fact that purpose and values are incredibly important. We need as human beings to have reasons for doing what we do. Big reasons. Why are you here? Well, maybe I'd like to leave the place a little better than I found it. And I think that ought to be motivation enough to get lots of business families and businesses and individual people working on some of these challenges.
Professor, following the success in Yogyakarta, the Indonesian Ministry of Health moved to scale the Wolbachia method nationwide. What makes a locally successful multi-stakeholder model such scalable, and what are the risks of scaling too quickly or without the
Yeah.
same depth of community engagement?
Yeah. Well, I think that's an open question. It's an open question. I have in Indonesia. Jakarta is a city of 400,000. Jakarta is a city of what, 18 million. And so it's a very different sense of scale. Um, I also think Probably saying scale it is not the best way to think about it. Because if we're right that this hyper local approach has to be there, it doesn't scale in the same way. I mean, the mosquito thing scales. I mean, you can have a factory to produce Wolbachia mosquitoes, but that's not the whole thing. Again, the technology is a part of it, but without that engagement at the kind of house by house level, I don't know how this will work. The good thing is there are projects. I just looked this up. There are projects in I think 15 countries around the world that are taking the Wolbachia mosquitoes and trying to attack things like dengue and Zika. So this is going on in Colombia and Australia and Brazil, in Vietnam, in Rio, in lots of places. So I think we're just kind of at the beginning of this.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question.
Yeah.
Defeating Dengue won the 2025 Sim Outstanding Book Award from the Academy of Management, a recognition of its significance beyond public health. What is the single most important message you hope readers, whether business leaders, policymakers, or academics, take away from this story?
Get out and do something. Get out and do something that's going to make a difference. Of course, businesses have to make money. Of course, people need, to have a viable economic career or job or whatever. But that's not all life is about. It's about trying to figure out how we can make our communities, how we can make our companies, how we can make our religious organizations, our schools and universities, how we can make them better. I think business can play a much bigger role in this, and do so without sacrificing profits, if you like. Um, and I think the Tahias have shown us one way to do it. It's not the only way, but have shown us one way to do it. But if I could say one thing from this book, I would say go out and do something, engage with your stakeholders, and figure out how how you can make theirs and your lives better. Um, and that's again, I have nothing but awe for the thousands of people that pull this off in Indonesia. If they can do this, we can do lots more in the world.
Thank you so much, Professor Freeman, for such an enriching and inspiring conversation. Defeating dengue is not just a story about disease. It's a masterclass in human collaboration, scientific courage, and the extraordinary things that become possible when the right stakeholders come together with a shared purpose. We hope this conversation sparks new thinking for everyone listening and remind us that all the world's biggest challenges are never too large when we face them together. Thank you once again for sharing so generously, sharing such compelling and thought-provoking insights from a remarkable book, Defeating Dengue, a multi-stakeholder approach to problem solving. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me, Deepak. It's been a real pleasure.